Well, good morning. I am so excited to be here and speaking with Phineas Baxandall, who's Senior Policy Analyst and Advocacy Director at MassBudget. How are you today, Phineas?
Good, really good to be here. Thanks for this conversation.
Great. Well, thank you for coming. This is the second session that we're hosting here to help people understand a little bit more about question number one that's on the Massachusetts ballot. As we sit here today, it is November, I have to look, it is November 3rd, and many people have already cast their ballot in early voting, but others have not. And even so, we'll need to understand a little bit more about the repercussions of whether this does pass or it does not pass, because it's really going to impact education, transportation, and business one way or the other. So let's start with an easy one. Phineas, can you tell me a little bit about MassBudget?
Sure. So MassBudget is a think tank which has been around we just celebrated our 35th anniversary, and we work on policy issues, particularly on the economy, just for Massachusetts. So just for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We don't work much on local policy, and we've developed a particular focus on policies that will improve life in Massachusetts for low and moderate income people in the Commonwealth. And I'd say since the murder of George Floyd, or even before then, I'd say the organization has also had a real focus on racial equity as being a central concern.
Great, thanks for that background. Let's jump right in here. So the concept of a millionaire's tax has been around for several years now. And I know that 4 years ago, we had MassBudget, along with some other groups, come and speak with our membership on, on what a millionaire's tax could do for Massachusetts. And so, what's happened in the last 4 years? This was already something that was voted on. Why now? Why this question? And a little bit more context.
Well, if I can, I think the context for this initiative goes back actually a little over 100 years, where if you see the Globe's editorial endorsing it recently, it really centered on this 1915 Constitutional Convention, where they highlight two decisions. One was to deprive women of the vote, and the other was to create an income tax that would not have different rates for different people. So not like the federal income tax, where we ask people of higher income to pay a higher rate. And there's a third decision that was made there that's also very important for what happened in the last 4 years. So what that Constitution is, one of the very first state income taxes, and it was at a time where people were very nervous of the idea of creating a state income tax, and so they did it in this way where they said, somebody taxed at 30 million has to be the same rate as someone at 30,000. Well, they couldn't conceive that people would make those kinds of numbers at the time, but at the time that was a kind of a safeguard for the delegates at that time. And so over years, there's been different attempts to try and make Massachusetts more like other states with income taxes, to have different rates for people with different ability to pay. And I think, frankly, the distrust of the legislature that you mentioned in your comments has been something that opponents have always been able to sort of say, well, do you really trust the legislature? And the main argument about that was always, right now they say they only want to use it to tax those people or have this rate, but do you really trust that they're not going to change, where the thresholds are or what the rates are? So what this particular question one does is it's responsive to what the voters were concerned about in the past. Is it says, okay, we will make it not a flexible thing that you have to trust the legislature about. There'll only be one kind of graduation, one difference, and where it is just at $1 million, and that'll increase with inflation the way other federal tax brackets do. So it constrained what the legislature could do. Of course, that's elicited, now the opposition says, oh, this is a bad idea because it constrains what the legislature should do. It should have more flexibility to change all these things. And, but that's just the nature of opposition. What happened 4 years ago was, I think, surprising to a lot of people, in that the Supreme Judicial Court turned back the initial what the ballot question had been. And it's basically the same language. What it did is when back 100 years ago, is the same constitutional convention. They weren't just concerned about an income tax, they were also very deeply concerned, suspicious of the idea of a public referendum, where the public had put forward a ballot question. And one of the things that they were concerned about is that people would be confused if the subjects weren't related enough. So you could imagine, a scenario where the water inspectors get together and they have a ballot question which says, let's quadruple the salaries of water inspectors, and we'll also have a monument for Big Papi, and say we all love the Red Sox, and it'll be known as the Big Papi Red Sox ballot initiative, and no one will pay attention to the water inspector salaries. Something kind of ridiculous like that, but all about if everything wasn't related. It's not a crazy idea, but the standards of it have never been quite clear. And so a new Supreme Court justices appointed by the governor ended up saying, no, these different elements aren't sufficiently related, so it has to go back. So now you may ask, well, if they said no to it, why are we about to vote on it, right? So you'll recall that it was only a public referendum, one that originated with the public, that these people 100 years ago were so suspicious of whether they could trust the public there. So the way they constructed it is, they said, if the legislature originates with this idea, then none of these kinds of these extra kinds of screens apply. So even though the work had done this, and all of the 150,000 signatures and such had happened as a popular movement among faith and community and labor groups, there are some legislators who said, well, we can originate it. And then that's how the whole thing had another 4-year cycle. And that's why we're here right now in 2022.
That's a lot. Thank you. It's important, I think, for people to understand, how what they're voting on has been developed, and it is not, it's not new. So there is a lot of confusion on this question. There's a lot of data being shared. There's a lot of different ways in which people can interpret the data, and both sides legitimately have some worries and concerns on what the outcome's going to be, and can you just dispel some of this confusion? And I would say that a lot of the confusion lies with the definition of income, and that's I think what people are worried about. There's a lot of one-time millionaires, and there cannot be a carve out for that. But I think there's others that think they might get hit with something that they may or may not. So if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about this, because it's something where I think actually the kind of name of calling it a millionaire's tax is very unhelpful in this respect, in that a lot of people may imagine, oh, okay, my uncle could leave me the beach house or something and I would be a millionaire, because millionaire, the definition is about wealth. And this is not a tax that taxes wealth. It's a tax on income. And most people don't understand what their income is defined by, and they may have a better understanding of what their wealth is, whether it's their retirement wealth, whether it's their housing wealth, whether it's their business wealth. None of those things are taxed by this law. This is only about your income, and that's something that people don't necessarily understand. So if it's your retirement income, and let's say you retire with $10 million worth of wealth and a big house, even then, it's not clear you'd even ever pay this tax, because you're not going to liquidate all of that $10 million in 1 year. If you're a woman who's 60, you're likely to live to 80. If you're a man, you're likely to live to not quite there. It wouldn't make sense for you to liquidate all that money. And even if you do, it's only the gain on that asset that you're taxed on. And then there's considerable deductions, such as a house. If it's your primary resident, you can then deduct another $500,000 off of that, and everything that you ever invested in improving the house, all of that deducts from what your capital gain is. Most people don't necessarily understand what comprises capital gains or something. So it's easy for people who want to kind of change the topic of who's going to pay for this. And I think one of the reasons, I talked to somebody who said that it's ballot questions where the popularity is really quite lopsided, that the people who look like they're on the losing side have to kind of change the subject. And so in my own perception of this, I hope you won't find this unfair, is that I think that the opponents of this are looking at the polling, which was showing really, really strong support for this, partly because people know that they never make $1 million of income in a single year, and probably don't know anyone else who does. And that the best way to try and get people unsure about this is to make it seem like, well, okay, don't think of it as a millionaire, think of it as you may know someone who's retired, and a retired person could pay it, so therefore it's about retirees, or therefore it's about small businesses, or somebody else other than someone earning $1 million. I think the clear facts on this, the facts on this are really clear, and it's not spin, it's just the IRS data, or there's the Massachusetts Department of Revenue data on this. It's less than 1% of tax filers, 0.6% of tax filers. And that's not something that the opposition has ever contested, as much as they're trying to change the subject about it. And it's, less than 1% of retired people, less than then what is it? It's about 2% of all house sales, not even counting the deductions that people could have, taking the primary residence deduction, but not considering all those other deductions for all the improvements that people can do. So it's really a minuscule number of people, and then only on that portion that's above $1 million.
So there is that perception, right? Your job is to go out and again dispel that perception, but there is still that perception. And so if this passes, what do you say about the notion that there'll be a mass exodus of business leaders, or potentially businesses, right? There's Mass TLC conducted a survey of its membership, and that was a big concern.
Well, we sort of stick to data, and the data on this is really pretty clear. If Massachusetts was going to be somehow sticking out on a limb with a high tax rate compared to other states, I think that would be a different story. But if you look at the states which have the most $1 million incomes and the densest, the highest concentration of $1 million incomes, it's California and New York. And what are the state tax rate. What are the tax rates, the combined state and local? We don't have local income taxes here, but they do in places like New York and San Francisco. And the combined tax rates in places like that, New York is 14.5 its tax rate. And here we are wringing our hands about 9, or California, it's 13.6. And after Tuesday, it might be over 15 because they're voting on another increase, so the places, and then other places that also have tax rates not quite at that level, but higher than what we're even talking about. New Jersey, Oregon, Minnesota, Hawaii. There's the places. This has been these tax rates exist in other places, and they have not seen an exodus that happens. I think the really strong research on this is partly because one benefit of having a lot of money is you get to choose where you live, and the people who have high incomes, they tend more often to have families, to have businesses, to be involved in their communities, to have the kinds of things that connect you to a place, to the networks, is partly one reason why people do make that much money. And so the extra 4% on starting with your second million starts to look pretty small potatoes as a consideration compared to all of the things about place, and the worries about about out-migration really have been chiefly about lower income people who aren't necessarily the biggest investors, right? We do have a problem with a lack of skilled labor in Massachusetts, at least compared to what people want, right? And we do have a problem where our transportation system doesn't allow people to easily get to where more affordable housing in the state is. So I think if you think of the question more generally about migration from the economy, you should be really excited about the Fair Share Amendment. You should be really excited about voting for question 1, because having more high skilled people in the economy, having a better transportation system where people feel comfortable about staying in Massachusetts and having commerce flow the way it should, that's going to require resources. And asking a little bit more from the people who can best afford it makes sense as the way to fund the future that way.
That brings me to my last question, which is the funding piece, the appropriation and the realities. So we know that the state does not allow you to earmark money in the Constitution. And so this question is written very explicitly that the monies deemed should go for education and transportation, but that ultimately it is up to the legislature, and this particular legislature is definitely set to do that. But 10 years from now, even 8 years from now, right, as you start to get into new cycles, what does the world look like? There's a lot of really amazing places that money could do great things at. So what is it that you think the reality of these funds are?
I'm so glad you asked about this, Sarah. I think that it's really odd that there's been this kind of challenge to the whole idea of dedicated taxes, because what you describe about not being able to at one point of time lock the hands of the legislature about exactly how their budget allocations will be in the future. I mean, I think at a very simple level, the money will go to education and transportation, because that's what the Constitution says. It's the strongest possible way for anyone who would want to take suit against the legislature, and that's where the monies will go. You're asking the more serious question about fungibility, and what we know from the past is that dedicated funds really do matter. I mean, you think about the gas tax. So the gas tax is dedicated for transportation. That's in the Constitution. And people have sued successfully when they don't think the money is being used sufficiently directed from the gas tax to transportation. That has been successful in the past when they want to do that. And I think, if you don't trust, if you think it's somehow illegitimate because you're not able to overcome our constitutional barriers to locking the hands of future legislators on their budget, then you should have that same illegitimacy for all of our dedicated revenues, whether it's our RMV fees, our gas taxes, or other kinds of dedicated revenues. I think this is a question which really has activated people's distrust about the legislature. So I think one way to ask this question is to say, how confident can I be in the legislature wanting to spend additional monies on education and transportation? Because as you point out, really is about additional monies, right? So I think, the way you can answer that, you'd say, so it's in the Constitution. So we know it's the strongest possible platform for legal action to make sure this happened. It trumps every other kind of law. You'd say, well, is it passed by a popular referendum? Because if it is, then that's something where the legislature feels more directly accountable than if it's just sort of what the speaker said last session or what last speaker said. Having it be from a ballot is the strongest possible way for it to be. And then you'd say, well, here, education and transportation, these are two policies that the legislature has been talking about forever, wanting to invest in. And they're constantly saying, well, we'd like to have early education. We'd like to have East-West Rail. We'd like to have these things, but we don't have the money, right? So here's the situation where it's programs that they want to spend money on, but it's even more than that because it's commitments that have already been made, right? The Student Opportunity Act. There's a commitment to try and to improve early education, given what we saw during the pandemic and the needs for that. The commitment to meet our climate goals, where the largest and fastest growing source of climate emissions are from transportation. We've already made these commitments. I think the bigger problem is going to be that even all of this money isn't going to be enough to meet all of these commitments, right? So, the legislature isn't going to say, well, it's easy to cover all of our commitments and all of our promises on education and transportation, and then we can find ways to redirect money somewhere else. I think that is not the issue. The hard thing for the legislature is going to be that they have greater commitments, greater needs, greater expectations from the public on them for what's going to happen for education and transportation than can even happen. I mean, this money is going to be crucial for having a good future of transportation, a good future of education, but it's not going to be everything for everyone. That's I think good news if you're worried about the legislature spending this money somewhere else, because the legislature is really going to be pressed to meet those kinds of commitments, those kinds of promises.
Thank you. So is there anything that I didn't ask that you think we should have covered?
I don't think so. Is there anything you can think of?
No. Except to say that, it's 6 days away. Really, it's 5 days away now. Well, probably no, 5 or 6 days. And we'll see. I mean, if this passes, then it means, we'll get to work a little bit more. If it doesn't pass, I suppose it's going to be back to the drawing board on how to think of some ways to get some funding in.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, there's ways, nobody's ever happy with any particular tax. If they're, looking to try and find billions of dollars from, the sales tax or from corporate income taxes, you'd certainly be hearing other kinds of objections about that. It really is a question of, well, where else are we going to get this revenue? Because it needs to be long-term revenue. Some of the reasons that we're not able to make these fulfill things like better early ed or mental health in schools is because we don't have the long-term kind of revenue source. The legislature doesn't want to make investments that they can't then follow through on. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for the conversation.
Phineas, thank you for coming and speaking with me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Excellent. Look forward to that. Take care, Sarah.